Ready? Hello, my name's Dale Adams of Planning Ahead of Time, and today I'm speaking with Stephen Garrett. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself all the way from Canada?
I sure would. And I'm on the west coast of Canada, so I'm like light years away from you all. But I'm a death shaman and a life specialist and coach. I've embraced death, dying, grief, and loss, and I'm working hard to help others do exactly the same thing.
Well, you've been working hard for a long time and doing a
Yeah,
lot of writing around the subject, haven't you?
I have. I've got my third book coming out entitled Grief's Walking Stick. It'll be out sometime this year, so it's the third in a series of how many I don't know.
Well, I saw the front cover because we were speaking about it before we actually hit the record. So yeah, I've seen the front cover to the book. So have you any idea of when it's going to be out this year and how people will get hold of it?
Yeah, I'm hoping it'll be ready by August, September. And I'll do, of course, my own marketing blast, as will my publisher. And Amazon, whether you like them or whether you don't, they've got huge distribution capacity. So it'll be available on Amazon.
Perfect. And you've obviously done the two books already. So
Yep.
do they all continue on from each other, or are they all separate entities altogether?
They're each separate, but you can see my growth and progression in my work as well. It started with a book called When Death Speaks, Listen, Learn, and Love, which was about my late sister Jodi's death and what it taught me. And then my late brother Peter died of cancer, so I wrote a book called When Cancer Came Knocking, How One Family Answered. And so it's just a journey through my own grief, loss, death, and dying process. And so as I grow and evolve, so does my writing.
Yeah, of course. And you wrote, and something I really love is the 7 languages of sorrow.
Yeah, yep. Yeah,
And
that's a really fun piece. I was, you may remember, Dale, the 5 love languages. I thought, well, if there's languages of love, there's got to be languages of sorrow. So I started to look into my client history and notice, oh yeah, some people like to paint. Oh yeah, some people like to write poetry. Oh yeah, some people like to sculpt. Oh yeah, some people like to go for a run. There was all these different ways that people would communicate their grief in their own unique language.
I liked when I spoke to you before, you were telling me really about some of the work that you've done and how you actually adapt your work around somebody's language of sorrow to enable them to bring out the grief.
Yep. I remember I had a client in New York years and years ago, and her daughter was killed by a drunk driver late at night. And it was a tragic, traumatic event. And so I don't know how she got my name, but she did. And we were talking, and she said about 10 minutes in, I don't do talk therapy. And I'm a talk therapist. I'm going, oh man, I've got a problem here. And so I asked a few more questions and got to know her a little bit. And she loved to paint. So I said to her, oh, that's cool. What do you think about painting me how you're feeling right now about the traumatic death of your daughter? And she started to cry. She said, I could paint my feelings to you. I said, 100%. And so she did this series of paintings she called Pain Has No Color. There were 9 paintings over 18 months, and you could see her grief evolve and clear through those 9 different paintings. It was fantastic.
That's incredible. And to be honest, it's so what people need because everybody's unique. We live uniquely.
Yep.
End of life is unique. The way we actually experience death, even the death of the same person. I didn't experience it the same as my brother when my mum died, or the same as my dad would have done. We all have our own experience of the same experience.
Exactly. And that's why the 7 languages is so helpful. In a family of, say, 5 people, there can be 5 different grief languages. And so mom and dad may expect the kids to grieve by talking about it, but the kids don't. They doodle or draw. I was working with one mother whose husband had died by suicide, and she was a talker and a motor, but her young boy, her 9-year-old boy, wasn't. and we were doing a Zoom session just like this. There were the three of us, and I noticed he had his head down and he was kind of doodling. So I asked the mom to go and make herself a cup of tea. And then I asked the young boy to show me what he was drawing. He said, "You'd like to see it?" I said, "Yeah." So he held up this picture, and it was done monochromatically in grays and blacks and those sorts of colors. It was a church on a hill with a path going down to a cemetery, into the cemetery with a tombstone that had "I love you, Dad" written on. Oh my, that
Wow. Yeah,
that
that's
sweet,
touching.
yeah, the sweet young boy was grieving absolutely in his own unique language. And so I helped mom learn how to draw so she could draw how she was feeling, and her son and her could relate using the same language.
That's interesting about actually bringing people onto the same, if you like, wave of grief so that they can understand each other in that grief.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Because
Here's
it
another.
does create a lot of problems when people don't understand each other and can get very frustrated. Well, you never cry or you never do this, and that must create its own issues in families.
Yep, 100%. And that's where some of the tension kind of gets brewed, and where some of the fighting gets going is when we can't see other people grieving in their unique way. And so we make their way wrong because it's not our way. And so when I work with a family, I help them become multi-grief lingual, so that each person's language of grief, each person's language of sorrow can be valued and honored as everybody else's is. Even sometimes a child may be kind of a quiet, meditative child, and they're just sitting quietly on the couch with a picture of Dad beside them. They're not crying, they're not writing, they're not talking, but they're grieving in their own unique way just by sitting still with a picture of Dad. I call that one the seeker, where they're more internal, more quiet, more spiritual, perhaps, if you will.
It's so interesting and multi-grief lingual. I actually wrote that down. I've not heard that, but it's so interesting the work that you're doing. And I find it really fascinating every time I speak with you. And when you come out with some of the stories about how you work with families and bring them together. And I remember you talking before about, I think, a child who used to play, as we would classic basketball, and I think you called it hoop at the time. And just
Yeah.
that was their way of, again, trying to just release some of the emotion they were carrying.
Yep. There's one of the languages is called the mover and the shaker, which is very kinesthetic. And with movers and shakers, you'll find if you invite them into your office to do a grief session, they can't sit still and they're up and down. And so when you're given that signal, what that means is they need to be moving their body first, and then they can engage their emotions and their speaking second. I'll often take movers and shakers out for a walk in the woods, or as with the case of young Lincoln, take him out onto the driveway and play some basketball. So he's moving his body and shooting hoops. And at the same time there, we can slide in these subtle little questions like, "Lincoln, how is it without your grandma?" "Oh, real shitty." Back to the hoops.
Yeah.
Because sometimes kids don't have that length of attention that we older people have. So it's finding these unique ways to make the person who's grieving right in their way of grieving, that they don't have to do it our way.
And I think that's the key to it all, isn't it? So many people are expected to sit in an office with a counsellor and talk it out. What I really loved when I spoke to you before, and you're giving the examples of it now, is how you adapted your work and what you were doing specifically to suit the individual that you were working with.
100%. It's, you hear the expression client-centered, and, it's a nice turn of phrase, but when you actually practice it, your practice as a grief counselor or as a counselor or as anybody needs to mirror what you're seeing in your client. I had a client who was a police officer, undercover guy, and man, oh man, he had a lot of grief. He'd seen a lot of ugly stuff, a lot of death. And the only place he felt safe to speak was in his big black pickup truck. So we'd hop in his big black pickup truck and we go driving up and down the highway doing sessions in his pickup truck. Why not?
Wow.
You know, it worked for him. You know, we did 3 months of sessions in a black pickup truck, and he didn't feel safe with me driving. He had to be in charge. So he drove, and we made big progress. And finally, one day after 6 months in the pickup truck, we were actually able to sit in a coffee shop and do a session in a coffee shop in public, which lets you know that he had made big progress.
Yeah.
So
That's quite incredible. And it does show just how different people can be, and also different ages. When you're working with different ages, there's a different language in itself there, isn't there?
absolutely. You know, an older adult who's lived life in different environments and different economies in different ways than younger people. I mean, gosh, when I was first born, there was no such thing as a laptop or Zoom or cell phones. Now they're just everyday tools. So we have different ways of existing in the world, and age is one of those markers. You can see it. You know, a grandpa talking to a great grandson, very different language, very different stories. And sometimes the grandson's like, what's grandpa talking about? And so that generational piece is also very important when it comes to grief. You know, my dad was raised up after the First World War and the Great Depression, and fought in the Second World War, so he was grief adverse. Like, he didn't want to have any more grief in his life, so he didn't talk about it. Well, I'm a direct result of my dad, and I've learned that talking about it is really important. So my boys after me have a whole different approach to dying, death, grief, and loss.
You saying that, I had the most beautiful conversation with my dad the other day, because he had been to see a friend who was in hospital, and she actually asked him, "Are you happy to talk to me about death?" And
Wow.
he said, "Yes, I'm very comfortable talking about it." And she started to say, I just want to die. I'm ready now." And he was talking to her, and she started to talk about spirit, and he acknowledged it and said, "Yeah, that's everything's fine. It's all okay." And he was so, I don't know the whole conversation. It wasn't for him to disclose all that to me. But when he phoned and I spoke to him about it, I said, "I'm so proud of how he spoke to her." And he related situations with my mom that we'd been through to this lady. And you think that's now the conversation he was able to have because of the conversations I'm constantly having. And
Yep.
and I thought, and he actually did say that he felt this lady hadn't necessarily been able to discuss her death with other people because not everybody's comfortable to talk about it. And I thought that was really quite incredible.
Yep. And that's why sometimes an end of life coach or a death doula or a grief counselor is so important to have access to, because they're not the family. And the family dynamics sometimes, I've worked with quite a few families where the one dying want to talk about it, but the ones who are going to survive the death were talking about hope and how dad or mom or George was going to survive. But the one dying is going like, I'm not surviving. And I want to talk about what it is I'm seeing, because I'm seeing some of my old friends who've predeceased me on the other side. Like, am I on drugs? And so an outsider sometimes can be that breath of fresh air, especially for the one who's dying, because
Yes.
they need to speak about it. Because depending on their religious beliefs or their spiritual beliefs, they may be scared like crazy. Like, what's after this? And I've often had people say, I sure hope there was a Jesus. Just things like that. Because they need somebody they can talk to honestly and frankly about what they're going through.
Well, you and I are both advocates for conversation around end of life, dying, death, post-death. I know you do quite a lot of speaking around this topic, don't you, to try and get people engaging in these conversations.
Yeah, 100%. And it's very important, we've got 1.7 billion baby boomers on the planet heading for the exit doors. That's a tremendous amount of death that we'll be facing over the next 12 to 15 years. And our culture, I don't know what it's like in Britain, but in Canada, we just had a survey released that was suggesting that 53% of Canadians feel their end-of-life grief needs are not met. So 1 in every 2 people is feeling like they're not getting their grief needs met, or that others don't understand them, or that they can't find services, or they can't access services. Wow, 1 in 2, and we've got a whack of baby boomers leaving. So it's
Scary thought, really, isn't it?
yeah, and it's such a beautiful opportunity to take this topic that we typically leave in the cupboard way back in the corner of the closet and bring it forward. And maybe, Dale, what's required here is a rebranding of the Grim Reaper. Maybe if we branded it as an inspirational teacher, we might have a better go of helping people sit with death.
Yes, very true. Very true,
And
because death is always made out to be something to fear.
yep. And maybe instead of a failure, maybe it's a graduation, depending on the perspective you take.
Yes.
For me, it's taking that different perspective that wasn't a direct result of fear-mongering of the Judeo-Christian religions way back in the 1340s. That's where it all began, was let's frighten our parishioners, and they did. We're still frightened. Not to make religion wrong, but to use death as a tool was not such a great idea, and it worked.
Yeah. So if people want to find out more about the work that you're doing and maybe look to buy your book in the future or the books that you've already released, how do they get hold of you?
Well, they can pop onto a website of mine called aliveInDeath.com. And there you'll get my contact information. I'll be putting my book up there when it's out. And I will also be starting a website called griefswalkingstick.com. So that'll be available soon as well. So.
Okay. And could you just remind us of the names of the other books in case people would like to have a look for them?
I sure can, Dale. Thank you. The first one was called When Death Comes Knocking, Listen, Learn, and Love. The second piece was a book written for my dear brother, Peter, called When Cancer Came Knocking, How One Family Answered. And my current book is Grief's Walking Stick, A Personal Journey from Sorrow to Service.
And the two that are already out and available, can they both be got on Amazon at the moment?
I believe When Death Speaks can be, yes.
Okay.
And
Other than that, they can go to your website.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. And you ship all around the world?
Of course.
Asking for a friend.
Absolutely.
Perfect. That's lovely. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you again, Stephen. Thank you for agreeing to do a pat chat with me.
Hey, you're most welcome, and I'm glad to be sitting with you and carry on the good work. Well done, hey, Dale, and I'm cheering for you 150%.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.